Good evening. Welcome to American Public Square at Jewell's post-election analysis. My name is Denisha Snell, Program Director for APS. I want to thank each of you for being here this evening for this important conversation. American Public Square at Jewell remains committed to our mission of improving the tone and quality of public discourse by helping our community meaningfully address society's most perplexing issues. Tonight is the first in a series of American Public Square programs examining how we move forward and bridge community divides post-election. I would like to thank everyone who made this program possible, including all the staff and volunteers for American Public Square. I would also like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program: William Jewell College, Marnie and John Sherman, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, and PlexPod. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions from the audience. Jack Steele, William Jewell student, will serve as your roving reporter today. Jack will be watching for any questions you may have for our guest. Please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom. If you are watching on Facebook, you can also ask questions by posting in the comments section. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator for this evening, Ambassador Allan Katz.
Thank you, Denisha. I'd like to acknowledge the students from William Jewell Symposium, which is a course that I teach, along with my colleague Gary Armstrong, entitled How We Choose Presidents, for the work in developing questions and participation in this program. Jack Still is a student in that class, and Jack will be curating the questions from his fellow students. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. First of all, we have Rosy Gonzalez-Speers, who's the founder and CEO of RG Speers. Rosy is a political and communication strategist. Terry Nelson is a founding managing partner at FP1 Strategies. Terry has led successful media campaigns for governors, members of Congress, ballot measures, and was involved in most of the competitive Senate races during this past year, which he is going to be telling us about. Jennifer Horn is a co-founder of the Lincoln Project and a communication strategy consultant. Jennifer served as chairman of the New Hampshire Republican Party from 2013 to 2017, and in 2008 was the congressional nominee for the Republican Party in the 2nd District of New Hampshire. Tom McMahon is the founding partner of NP Strategy Group. Tom has served as the executive director of the Democratic National Committee and helped modernize the Democratic Party through its use of social media and peer-to-peer platforms. And finally, but certainly not last, we have Maggie Nelson Collins, who is the founder and managing principal of the Howe Street Group, where they offer a range of nonprofit and public policy consulting services. I'd like to sort of note for the record here, of our 5 panelists, 3 of them are Republicans and 2 are Democrats. To those people who think that we lean too much to the left, I thought we'd sort of try to even things out tonight a little. So I want to thank you all for being here. And let me start this off, Terry, with you. Your firm was involved in most of the competitive U.S. Senate races this year. What's your take on what happened, why it happened, and what was the most surprising thing to you, and what do you think impacted the outcome the way it did the most?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question. And I think we're still sorting some of that out. But I think the real frame of the race as we went through this, I think, was really around pandemic and pandemic response and how that impacted races around the country. A lot of that obviously was focused on the presidential races, but it had big impact at the Senate and congressional level as well. I think, one of the things that I took away from the election was that, and I kind of thought going into it, was that the concerns were a little bit broader than that by a lot of voters. The economy was a big concern, and that showed up in the exit polling as well, and Republicans tended to do better on that. I think that there was a period of time as we kind of went through the race, or the election overall, where it looked like a lot of states that at the beginning of the cycle weren't going to be very competitive, became competitive. Some of them became competitive due to the quality of the Democratic candidates. So Montana would be an example of that, where Governor Bullock decided to run against Steve Daines, who was a client of ours. His entry into the race, made that a much more interesting race, but Montana, being the state that it is, still leaned Republican. But like a lot of other states that leaned Republican or looked very Republican, like South Carolina, I remember Ellen in our last program, you asked me whether Lindsey Graham was going to lose. Those states ended up behaving more traditionally Republican. They ended up kind of behaving the way that you would expect them to behave. You saw the same dynamic in the presidential race as well in a number of these states. And so, but there was clearly a time when a lot of those states looked very competitive. And I know we'll talk about polling at some point. Some of that had to do with how some of the polling was conducted. But they looked very competitive, and I would say some of them were much more competitive than they would be in a sort of standard election year. But again, at the end of the day, they weren't. And so we ended up, by and large, with a group of states that I think if you'd ask anybody involved in politics, what are the competitive states going to be for the Senate? That's pretty much what we ended up with at the end of the day in terms of where the real races were. And that happened despite, a lot of money really flowing on the Democratic side into some of these campaigns. And so, I think just to sort of sum it up, I think that there was a view about how voters were really perceiving the election that around the pandemic that I think ended up, the voters had a sort of a broader view. I think Republican states and Republican leaning states tended to behave like that. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that, Georgia probably being the most prominent one. And we ended up with a group of competitive states that we thought would be competitive at the end of the day. I think Republicans got a break in that Susan Collins got over 50% of the vote, which meant that we didn't end up in ranked choice voting in Maine, which was a good thing for her. She probably would have won if she had just been slightly under 50, but that was a real big open question. And I think one of the surprises of the night, as you talk to people going into election day, we were not involved there, because I would talk to people who were, was that she got over 50% of the vote in Maine.
Okay, well, thank you. So Rosy, why don't you explain, if you can, I mean, all the Democratic candidates had more money than they've ever, gobs of money. No one lost any races because they didn't have enough money. All the polls indicated that there were all these other races, not just the ones Terry's alluded to that we all saw in the beginning, which would have been, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine. They're the four competitors. All these other states. How come the Democrats did so poorly?
Well, I spent the last 2 years in most of this cycle in Florida, and as we all know, Florida ended up being pretty close to a disaster for Democrats. We lost not just the state, but we lost down ballot. We lost 2 congressional seats and also some incumbent House seats there as well. I think a few things here. First, I just want to speak to Florida and specifically because that's where my firm has really spent the bulk of our time this cycle. I think the Latino vote, speaking as a Latina, is a lot more complex than a lot of Democrats have campaigned with in the past. In Florida, I don't want to blame the loss just on the Latino vote. Latinos were huge for Biden in Nevada and Arizona and key to those wins. But what we did see across the country was an increase in the Latino vote for Trump. And we saw a big increase in Florida as well. So, I think as Democrats, the first thing is we have to learn how to win. We won. So that's the first thing that happened. We won. Joe Biden's going to be the next president, and that's very exciting. But we also have to really take a look at, how do we get better with our data? How do we take some stock into how to run more nuanced campaigns and by nuanced, I mean, we tend to really go towards this campaign by slogan. So defund the police, abolish ICE, these kind of taglines that are ones that despite the meaning behind it and whether you agree with that meaning or not, when you're explaining in politics, you're losing. So when you have to explain what these taglines mean to such a large part of the electorate, it puts us in a difficult spot, especially in battleground states. So that is my quick thought as to why we lost in some of these places. I think The other thing is we need to get used to some long-term organizing and investment. Georgia didn't flip overnight. That was 10 years in the making with some real discipline and leadership. And we also have to learn as Democrats how to really do some long-term planning the way Republicans do, and do that effectively.
Okay, thank you. Tom, you effectively ran the Democratic Party from 2004 and 2008, went from the disaster of 2004 to the great success of 2008. And you've been involved in terms of the question of, which Rosy raises. We learned a better way to communicate. Are we on the ground in a way that the Democrats need to be, and particularly now with this sort of sniping between progressives and moderates. What's your take on it, and what's your take on how the Democratic Party moves forward in an effective way?
I mean, listen, I think anytime you have elections that come and you take over the White House or you lose the White House, there's a kind of a ground shifting that occurs. And the nature of the ground shifting is what is my lot in life now, and how do I use my voice effectively? And I think that's kind of what you're seeing currently between the progressives and the moderates with the Democratic Party, which is, I think people are trying to figure out how it's all going to shake out. I think if you talked to Democrats a week ago, and all their grand ambitions as to what it was going to be, because people were predicting 15 to 20 pickups in the House of Representatives, the Senate, Chuck Schumer would be the new Senate Majority Leader. And I think what you're finding out is the new reality, roughly 9 days later, is a lot different landscape. And so I think the spheres of influence and everything else are still kind of working themselves out, but you're starting to see what the Biden administration is starting to lay out in terms of where the picks are going to be. They don't really have the opportunities to pick any senators, primarily that from the progressive wing of the party. In the current landscape, what they're talking about, because there's Republican governors in those particular states, and they would be able to pick a Republican senator in those states. And then what you're seeing in the House is the House has actually lost seats. And so Nancy Pelosi's speakership is contingent on just a handful of House seats. And what you don't want to suddenly do is vacate those seats by people going into the administration. And so that presents the challenges. Now, going forward, I think what you're going to see over the course of the next 90 days is some jockeying in terms of trying to use leverage points to move forward and everything else. And I think that is the challenges coming out. I think if you talk to different folks within the Biden camp, they believe that it was the coalescing that occurred around a moderate candidate that could actually win the general election, and they believe that is what got them there. I think there's a lot of variations. I think the whole Democratic Party was energized in a way it hasn't been before. I think you had the progressive side do an incredible job organizing everything else. And I think that is a part that's going to kind of have to play it out. And I'm going to touch upon one thing that I completely agree with Rosy and Allan, what you touched on the front end, is I think Democrats have never been able to successfully realize how to properly invest money. And so in this particular election cycle, there was no shortage of resources to do different things. But I would argue they didn't spend the money wisely. And what they tried to do is you would have, and I'm sure Rosy saw it firsthand in Florida, I saw it occur in numerous states, we had very conflicting messages because you had 15 different groups running ads in targeted races that oftentimes stepped on each other. And so there was no, I think that's what Terry Republicans did a great job of, is they were running on 2 to 3 really well-defined themes as to help their candidates get across the finish line. And if you looked at any political ads in any of the battleground states, it was very, very muddled as to what Democrats were standing for, what Democrats were fighting for. And it was really hard to break through. And in many ways, it would kind of exacerbate fears that people would have about one party being in complete control in the U.S. Capitol. But anyway.
Okay, well, thanks, Tom. Maggie, you ran a local race this time around. You're in Kansas, so it's a Republican state. So my questions would be, number one, how much do the national trends that people have been talking about affect the races that you saw and that you were involved in? And because you come from a Republican state, or state, I think, with one federally elected Democrat, are we likely to see any movement from any of those people to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the election anytime soon?
Sure. So let me address the first part of that in terms of how the national trends affected a local race. And I agree with Terry's initial assessment that is, despite some early movement and thinking that there may be ways to flip certain seats or certain states. At the end of the day, most Republican states continue to act like Republican states. Most Democrat states continue to act like Democrat states. Where I spent this last cycle was working on the Republican candidate Amanda Adkins here in the 3rd District of Kansas, which is the only federally elected Democrat seat from Kansas. So the unique perspective there is that, for those who aren't aware, the 3rd District in Kansas is, for all intents and purposes, the Kansas City suburbs on the Kansas side. And so we are dealing in this district with a large city mentality in a huge state that is very much conservative. So in order for a Republican candidate to win in this district on this ticket during a pandemic under President Trump, the candidate has to far outperform the president. And in order to do that, you have to define your message and separate from the president. And that is a very hard thing to do, as we saw. This seat, the 3rd District, it's gone back and forth quite a bit, actually. Congresswoman Sharice Davids, she was a first-term incumbent, was a Democrat. It was Republican before that, Democrat before that. So it's truly a seat that does have the potential to change. I think given the unique demographics within this district and the fact that this district is moving more liberal, but there are still some very strong conservatives. However, candidly speaking, the president is not popular in this district, and that makes it very hard for a Republican to flip that seat. And that's what we saw. In terms of, I think your other question was, will we see Republicans across the state recognize the president? And I'm sure we'll get into this with everyone, throughout this conversation. I think when Americans have confidence in the system and have faith that their votes are counted the way they should, I think you'll see confidence in the electorate, confidence in the process. And at that point, yes, everyone will come around and recognize the president-elect as president-elect. I think at the back end of that is that you have to have confidence in the process. And the president, candidly, is within every right to challenge the process if he feels that there has been a high potential for fraud. I do think that, I don't think it will be overturned, I really don't. But I think what's interesting is the reason President Trump continues to fight for this is because that's sort of what he did. That's why Americans and Republicans liked him, because he's given Republicans permission to fight, which we haven't really done a great job of in the past. So is it going to change the outcome of the election? My personal opinion is no. Will these federally elected officials on both sides of the aisle eventually acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect? Yes, I think they will.
Okay, I would just want one quick sidebar there before we get to Jennifer, and that is, as someone who was a Democrat in Florida in 2000, you guys fought pretty well in Florida in 2000. So I think you're not giving your side enough credit. But Jennifer,
well, that was 500 votes. So.
Okay. Yeah, right. Okay. So Jennifer, you come to this. You're either loved by everybody or hated by everybody, depending upon where you're sitting. You've got Democrats who think that too much sort of tipping of the hat was done to the moderate wing in this now. You've got Republicans who will never forgive you for having not supported the nominee. Give me your sense of, we're through it all now. You guys raised an enormous amount of money. You had an impact, we think. Would you tell us what the impact you think you had? And looking back now, what would you do differently?
Sure. Well, first, lucky for me, having whether or not the Republican Party forgives me or likes me was not high on my list of priorities when I got into all of this. A couple of things, and also a few things in response maybe to some things that have already been said. First of all, the Lincoln Project had a very narrow lane that we were playing in from the beginning. We came into this saying that if we could move between 3 and 4% of Republican votes over to the Democratic nominee, that we could defeat Donald Trump. And so that's been, that's a Republicans and right-leaning independents, and that's where we stayed in that race. I think Terry's right. Down ballot voters behaved much more like they normally would, and to a greater degree even than we anticipated that they would. But at the presidential level, that was very much not the case. We played in most, if not every battleground state, and what we found in the end, after the votes were counted, but our analysis, as well as wrapping in the analysis of other organizations, is that about 6.8% of people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 voted for Joe Biden in 2020. That was our lane. So we actually exceeded that 3 to 4%. I think in every single state we played in, except for North Carolina, where I think we held it right at between 3 and 4%, and it just wasn't enough. But in those other states, 6%, 8%, 9%. So that was our lane in the presidential race for the Lincoln Project. I think it's really important to emphasize, however, as we process all this and talk about it, and we're talking about the president's attacking of the outcome of the presidential race. Of course, he has every right to, access whatever legal, path is out there, whatever legal resources are available for a candidate who wants to question the outcome of the race. But the truth is that there is zero evidence of fraud at a grand scale anywhere in any state. And all of the court challenges that the president has brought forth have seen that. They've all been rejected. And I just think when we talk about the confidence in the system, that's incredibly important. I think Republicans and Democrats both agree how important it is that the American people have confidence in our electoral system, that we all recognize that free and fair elections are a cornerstone of American democracy, and they have to be protected. But I don't think we're being honest if we don't say straight out that the president is trying to undermine the people's confidence in that, not anybody else. I just think that that's a really important thing. When we look at the Senate races, there's no question, the Lincoln Project, we spent about somewhere between 10 and 15% of our resources on these Senate races, and we did not achieve the outcome certainly that we were looking for in the majority of those cases. We played early in Colorado and Arizona. We were able to kind of help fuel what happened there, and we will obviously be engaged in Georgia in a serious way. I think you can't underestimate the degree to which what happened at the presidential level in Georgia is significant. That is it's not just like a throw off. It's not a one off. I think that's a fairly big deal. And from the perspective of the Lincoln Project, at least, we're not particularly concerned, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, about whether how the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is looking at our participation in this. We really were fueled from the beginning by this idea that we needed to separate from party politics and do what we thought was really right for the country. And so when we look at the presidential race, I'm actually very satisfied with the outcome and with the role that we played in it.
Well, thank you. And before we get to questions, I would sort of like to throw sort of a jump ball to anyone who would like to respond to this. I think my sense of things is that Donald Trump outperformed as a candidate all expectations certainly on the Democratic side, and that he basically brought people out in law. The people he brought out that didn't vote in 2016 led to some of the successes Republican down ballot candidates had, because they showed up and they voted. Once they were showing up for Trump, they wouldn't vote for nothing but Republicans. Is that a sort of, was it 16 million people voted, 18 million people voted who didn't vote in 2016? I told someone the other day, a Republican friend, I said, I think Trump gets credit for all of them on both sides showing up. Is that analysis, though, is that consistent with what you saw out there? Terry, you want to take a swing at that?
Look, I think everybody anticipated that the turnout in the election would be very, very high. And I think as we got closer and closer to election day, it seemed very likely also that it would be the highest it's been, in, I guess, as it turns out, a century. I don't know if I would have said that, but I'm also never quite sure how we really know how many people voted a century ago, but maybe we do. And if your turnout's going to be really high, it's going to be really high on both sides. I think one of the advantages that that you have when you have the presidency is that you have people who are working for over 3 or 4 years to try to achieve a certain outcome. And the RNC did invest a lot in sort of on the ground grassroots activities to get people out to vote. I'm not on the data side. I heard Rosy articulate concerns about the data on the Democratic side. Maybe the data is better for us. I hear complaints about it, just like I'm sure they hear complaints about it on their campaigns. Data, I think, can always be improved. But there was a significant investment overall in turnout, and I do think that helped Trump's numbers overall. But I was not surprised to see that the vote for Trump went up because people were much more engaged on both sides. And I just final point I would make about it, I don't think you can look back at the 2016 Trump campaign and say, well, this was a campaign that was really well organized, that was hitting on all cylinders and doing everything that it could to turn people out. It was a message campaign, and that message resonated with voters in that campaign, but it didn't have the mechanical side that a typical presidential campaign would have.
Okay, Tom and Rosy.
And Allan,
go ahead, Rosy.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know that the narrative has kind of been that Democrats thought we were going to have a landslide, but I did not speak to one Democratic operative who believed that or thought that. Maybe our electorate did and our activists did, but I mean, every time anyone put out a poll showing Biden up by 5 points in any battleground state, we were the first to come out and say that is not true. That does not exist. Please stay focused. A landslide in Florida is 1%. So we were just very disciplined. I don't think any of us believed that this was going to be, a blue wave year. I do think we lost more seats than we had anticipated losing. But, our turnout models, I think, were right. We knew there was a lot of passion and enthusiasm on both sides. And all of our models showed that this was going to be a huge turnout election. And of course, we reached historic levels. I think to something that Jennifer said with the Lincoln Project's role, it had to take a wide coalition for us to win this race at the top of the ticket. I really believe that the only way for us to pull this off was by building a broad coalition, and we should pay attention to that. However, we must also remember that at the end of the day, this election was won on the back of Black women. The African-American vote and African-American women delivered this win for Biden at historic levels. And I'm always cautious of either or scenarios. I think we can do both. I think it is important to both build a broad coalition and also pay attention to our base. I don't think we have to pick. And I think if Democrats can do that effectively moving forward, we can win more. But this whole it's going to be a blue wave is just not something that anyone who was working in a battleground state believed.
Okay, Maggie, did you think that there was going to be more? I mean, did you think the Senate race in Kansas was going to be a lot closer than it was, or did you all along see it as a double-digit race?
I thought it might be slightly closer than it was. I did not actually think that seat would flip. If you talked to just people in the Johnson County 3rd Congressional District, you might think that. But when you think about everything west, that's a lot of conservative voters. That's hard to turn. So no, I wasn't entirely surprised by that. Frankly, I was more surprised by how much money the parties were willing to put into that race from a national level than I was about the actual outcome of it.
Tom, I was watching the other day when AOC was on with Jake Tapper, And basically the question was raised about what about those candidates that were targeted by Republicans and socialists and defund the police, which was sort of picking up the criticism that had come out of the Democratic caucus. I thought her response was very interesting. She said, first of all, no one who ran on those as a socialist or for defunding the police lost, because those were the few candidates that used those terms used them in districts where they were going to win anyway.
Right.
But the main point of what she had to say, I thought, was we are behind in terms of using, digital communications. And what we need to be able to do is combat the message, because theoretically, for example, you've got Kelly Loeffler embracing a QAnon candidate in Georgia, but the Democrats don't seem to be able to sort of have the same impact on voters with something like that the Republicans seem to be able to do with socialism and defunding the police. Is that a failure of infrastructure or innovation, or just the way it is?
I mean, that's a good question. I think it's a loaded question. I don't think it's something that you can answer in, a 45-second quip. But I just think the nature of, like, if you look at the divide in the media landscape in terms of what is believed, depending on what source of where you get your information. So, for instance, there's a Morning Consult poll that came out that said 70% of Republicans don't think that Biden was, something to the effect of fairly elected in this. And, that's kind of an interesting number because it just shows you the divide that's occurring, across the political landscape. And it just shows you that when you start believing some of the conspiracy theories out there, like COVID is something that's going to magically go away post the election, like some of the misinformation that's out there and where the source of information as to where they get it from their news sources or, whatever the theories are is kind of alarming. And I think from having heard AOC talk about a lot of these different things, people are very good about, really trying to typecast her after, a sentence or two that she says. But if you really listen to what she says, she's kind of thoughtful about what she's talking about. She is correct that, safe Democrats are going to be safe Democrats and safe Republicans are going to be safe Republicans, and they're going to be able to get away with some things that other people may not. But when she talks about kind of what's happening in terms of our ability to communicate, as the leadership in our party tends to be older than what the average voters will engage on an issue and how long they'll engage on an issue, that's an important consideration that we should factor in. And it's something that we don't.
Okay, picking up on that, Jennifer, one of the things that she said, and then we are going to get the questions, I promise, that basically Democrats have a tendency to sort of rely on big screen communication, and Republicans are better at small screen, i.e. your phone communication. With the Lincoln Project, were you guys doing I know you were doing a lot of your ads were online, but do you think that critique has merit?
Well, I can't speak for the Democratic Party and what their strategic strengths are necessarily, but at the Lincoln Project, we actually invested pretty heavily both in broadcast and in digital. And we recognized early on that our best opportunity to communicate with our voters was going to be digital, because again, keep in mind, we were talking to a very narrow demographic, a very narrowly defined demographic. So spending a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars, blasting television commercials, or, it's kind of like just shooting in the dark almost. Whereas on the digital platform, we could find our specific human beings and follow them and communicate with them over the long haul. And I also just have to say, to a point that Rosy made earlier, I think she's absolutely right about the need to build coalitions. And that's where we saw our role, in the Lincoln Project, because while we were trying to target a certain percentage of folks who had voted Republican in 2016 and try to move them to vote for the Democratic nominee in 2020, we weren't just looking at one demographic of people. We had to pick, it was always off the margins. We were looking at African American voters, we were looking at evangelical voters, we were looking at suburban women voters. We were talking very much to Latino voters, especially in Arizona, for example, where we had significant success in moving some of those votes. So regardless, again, I can't speak to the digital strategy of the DNC or the Democratic candidates, but there's no question that when you are trying to target finely defined demographics, finely defined groups of people, you're going to be more effective almost always digitally rather than on broadcast television, at least in this day and age.
Okay, well, thank you. We're going to go to some questions now. Jack.
So Allan, I want to piggyback on that because both Jennifer and Rosy have commented on this very segmented, targeted need to identify your voters. And that is certainly not exclusive to the Democratic Party. And
right.
The same thing happens on our side. If you look at me as a personal example, a college educated suburban mom, how do you get to me versus working mom versus a college educated stay-at-home mom? Our messages are different, and targeting those messages and finding the right people and getting that message exactly right makes a difference now, where previously you could be more effective at a broader level. But I would agree with both of them on that fact that it's not exclusive to the Democrats. The Republicans have a lot of work to do on that as well. And for someone like me, I'm a conservative Midwestern mom who works when she can. I feel like I'm a fiscal conservative that doesn't really have a good home sometimes. And so that's part of building those coalitions across the board, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat.
And Allan, I know you want to get to questions. Let me Maggie just reminded me of something else that I think is part of this conversation. You know, one of the things we did at the Lincoln Project was we produced an enormous amount of ads, somewhere between 100 and 150 ads, and we put them out. We put them out on social media, we put them out online. And at the beginning, people were saying, so what's the deal with the ads? Or aren't you going to spend any money on TV? We did eventually. But what was more important that we did with them is that we spent months message testing them digitally, online. And so by the time the general election came around, we not only knew who our voters were and where they lived, we knew which of our messages was going to be most effective with them. And we were able to target them on a county by county basis, a county by county level with that messaging. So the degree to which the digital targeting opens the door, the opportunity for effectiveness. You put the money into making the ads, you don't have to always spend the money, which is an extraordinary expense, to put them up on television. We were able to take that big library of messages that that our creative team put together and target them in a very specific, finely tuned manner.
Okay, well, thank you. So Jack, you got some questions there, I know, from the students. Why don't you start with the first one?
Yeah, absolutely. So as tonight's roving reporter, obviously I'm going to be asking some questions on behalf of audience members using the Q&A feature, and also on behalf of students and a symposium taught by Ambassador Katz and Dr. Armstrong, a political science professor here at Jewell. And a lot of these students in this symposium learning about the presidential election are first-time voters, and several of the questions that they posed to the panel tonight are related to the notion of whether or not this election was a referendum election or a choice election. So the question that I have on behalf of these students tonight is, in classic terms, based on your preliminary analysis, should we see the 2020 presidential election as a referendum election or as a choice election? If it turned out to be a referendum election, what are the key lessons that Republicans may not want to hear? And if it has turned out to be a choice election, what are the key lessons that Democrats may not want to hear?
Who wants to take the first swing at that? Come on, this is not a shy group.
Well, I mean, I'll jump in. I think anytime you have an incumbent election at the presidential level, it's a referendum election. But I think it's a two-part choice. And I think we saw this in 2004, which is in 2004, people make the decision, and Allan and I've had several conversations about this. But in a referendum election, it's like, do I want to get rid of the incumbent? And it's a yes or no. And then if you say yes, you look at the alternative. And in 2004, I think voters looked at John Kerry and decided they then felt that John Kerry wasn't a suitable replacement, so they stuck with Bush. But I do think that was a referendum election. I think in this particular case, they looked at Biden and wanted to stick with Biden. So I would argue, yes, it was a referendum election.
I agree with that. And I agree with that. And just something that I said earlier is because I'm seeing this conversation a lot on the Democratic side about the election being close and, what does this mean? And 70 million people still voted for Trump. is that we won. And so I do think it was a referendum election, but at the same time, you know, we won this election, whether it was by 5 million votes or 537 votes, you still get to shape the future of this country. And so I think that's most important at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Allan, you know, the part of that question was, you know, what are the tough lessons that Republicans, you know, might have to learn from this? I think it was a referendum election. When all is said and done, Joe Biden is going to have as many electoral college votes, or very, very close, that as Donald Trump did in 2016. He's going to win the popular vote by a significant margin. And when you see the way that the outcomes were sort of divided from the presidential race down ballot to Senate race, there's no question that the American people looked at Joe Biden and Donald Trump and fully rejected what Donald Trump had brought to the table. I think the referendum was on character and was on leadership. And I think that the pandemic really finally defined that for a lot of voters, especially when you see so many Republican voters crossing the line to vote for Joe Biden. I do think we have to be careful, however, about the idea of the Democrats won. So, you know, with all due respect, Rosy, the idea that Democrats won so they get to define the future or shape the future. I think that one of the lessons out of this divided outcome is that the American people are really looking for leadership that comes from both sides, that allows both sides to be heard, to be at the table together. I think they want the era of division, of a really dangerous divisiveness in Washington. I think the American people are tired of it, and they want to see that behind us. I think the strongest thing Joe Biden can do coming out of the gate would be to reach out, not just across his party, to the wide spectrum in his party, but to make an obvious effort to reach across the aisle and to bring some of those Republican voices to the table as well.
Anyone else want to chime in on that, or we go to the next question? Anybody else? Okay. Jack, what's your next question?
Yeah, sure. So some of the other questions from students have been with regard to polling. So the polling leading up to the election showed what looked like a landslide victory for Democrats across the board, which is not what happened on November 3rd. The same thing happened in the 2016 election with what looked to be a clear victory for Clinton in the weeks leading up to the election. What, if anything, are the major pollsters missing?
I'll take one.
Go ahead, Terry. You want to take it? You want to make all your pollster friends happy?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I thought, and I think Rosy said this earlier, and Allan, I chatted about this or texted about it before the election. I thought that the swing states at the presidential level and at the Senate level were all very close, and that it looked like it could go either way based on that. I had my views on which way it would go, but that all of these states were close, and all of them could tip one way or the other. And typically what we would see in a presidential race is that all of these close Senate races would have tipped to the winner of the presidential contest. That's what's happened most of the time. In this case, it didn't. And I think that we're in a, which isn't to say that all the private surveys were right, because, I saw a lot of them and some of them weren't, but my general view is that we were in a very close race going into it. When you look at the public surveys, I think your general view would have been a little bit different than that. There were a lot of national surveys that had Joe Biden up by, I think, 10 points or so. There were a lot of state surveys in swing states that had him up, pretty significantly. I did work in Arizona. I think there were a number of surveys there that had him up, high single digits, low double digits as well. I think one of the things that I think there's, part of the problem with how we consume polling is that it's mostly consumed by the public on TV news. A lot of it's consumed on partisan networks, whether we're talking about Fox or MSNBC. And so they're really spun to the people, the activists and the partisans out there, and give an impression of things. But there's really no discussion about are the demographics of the survey right in terms of the Democrat-Republican breakup. There were surveys in this country or in these states that had 50% of the respondents as college educated, which isn't true, I think, almost anywhere. And if your survey, if you don't look at what the college education is on your survey, you're not going to see the Democratic skew in it necessarily. So, these are things we kind of take surveys and how they're presented to the public on face value based on what's said by the presenter. But there's a lot that goes into the surveys that aren't explained and that aren't critically looked at by news organizations.
Well, a friend of mine, and I'll talk about the polling in a second, afterwards, actually, he's a member of our board, Paul Russell, said to me, next time, instead of paying for pollsters, they ought to just buy a farmer's almanac. And they probably do, but just about as well. I do think the national polls really gave a very, very skewed view of what was happening. Does that mean we shouldn't even bother paying attention to them next time? Anybody?
Well, I might be slightly more critical. I mean, I agree with everything what Terry said. I think they're used today as clickbait to get clicks, to drive the story, to drive a narrative. And the nature of the social media platforms and individuals is you want to promote good news as to what you believe. But when you take a deeper look, not only the sample sizes are way too small for like you would to draw true conclusions. So what you would see in some of these states is a sample size of 300 to 400 on a major network. And you would be like, that's a really small sample size for the state of Arizona to tell us what the state of play is, because a very small sampling can have a wide swing in terms of what the numbers are. But you're also not getting the true cross-representation what the general population is. And generally, more often than not, in order to be a participant in a survey is, have you voted in 2 of the last 3 previous elections? And this whole election with early vote and everything else, people knew that there was a surge of new voters or people that were lapsed voters voting this election. And I shouldn't say none, very few of the polling I saw took that in as a factor. And that can skew these results to give people a false sense of whatever the narrative, what the reality is.
Okay. Maggie, you want to jump in for a second?
Well, I don't want to overlook the fact that there is at least one pollster that got it right this time and last time, and that's the Trafalgar Group, that they have found a way to pull in the Republicans who typically shy away from polling. So there is a way to do it right. It's just the majority of the pollsters today aren't doing that. And maybe Trump exacerbated that because there are fewer Republicans willing to publicly say that they're supporting Trump, but maybe it's a complete shift in how we really need to look at the electorate and look at who's voting. So is polling dead? No. Do they need to improve their process? Yes. And are we going to continue to put as much weight into the polls? I hesitantly say probably, but I'm not sure that we should. I think we probably need to find a better way to do it.
You know what else though with that, Allan, and Maggie kind of alluded to this a little bit. I'm always fascinated with polling and overlaying it with just kind of human nature, human instinct, taking the numbers but then, adding into that just who we are as people. And because we didn't see this kind of problem with the polls in the midterm elections. It was significant in 2016 when Trump was on the ballot. It was significant, also in 2020 with Trump on the ballot. And I think that I don't know exactly what it means or how that plays in, but I don't think that we can ignore it. I think to Maggie's point, in this cycle, there were probably some Republicans who didn't want to acknowledge that they were still going to support the president. And I think that what we're finding as the numbers are really being analyzed, that I think what we did not expect was the degree to which new voters were going to come to the table in this cycle. We thought we had that influx of new voters from Trump in 2016 and kind of thought, okay, well, there they are. They're in the rolls now. We know who they are. We can deal with them. Even more new people came out this time. And I'm not sure that the polls accounted for that.
I think that's probably so. Jack, you got another question for us?
Yeah, I sure do. So kind of shifting more into a conversation about what the post-election landscape will look like in the United States. This for the panelists. Do you think the Biden administration will be successful in passing its campaign promises, or do you think that we will continue to see intense political gridlock within our government?
That's sort of a softball. Who wants to take that one?
I can go first on this one. I think that the Biden administration will be very successful. I mean, they are, of course, coming in to govern during a time where we are facing a massive economic recession, where we have a pandemic, where we have civil unrest and racial tension that are now, very high across this country. So they have a lot of different crises at their hands that they need to manage. But I do think that the Biden-Harris ticket is the right one to, if we were going to choose anyone to lead us through this. I think their expertise. I mean, we saw today that Biden appointed Ron Klein as his chief of staff. That's a great choice, extremely experienced. And I think we're going to see professionals back at the table and some experience back at the table to help us pull this country back together. I do want to also comment on something that Jennifer said earlier about the unity piece. I agree that the unity piece is extremely important, and it's what it's going to take to move this country forward. However, we saw in the Obama administration, when Obama first got elected, that a lot of progress was impeded by this need to have Republicans at the table to, for example, pass a stimulus bill, which then none of the Republicans voted for in the end. I think that we need to be careful to not impede progress in some of these places that the country needs, because ultimately it's the Biden administration that is going to get blamed for it. So I hope that Republicans will come to the table and will work with us to move this country forward, and things that the majority of the electorate and the population agrees on. But I also hope that Republicans are not holding Democrats to a standard that they haven't yet upheld themselves, and they do not come to the table, and they do not care if Democrats are at the table. We oftentimes, as Democrats, we try to lead by example and try to be the bigger person, as Michelle Obama says, when they go low, we go high. But this is a time to govern. Our country's in crisis, and I think that the administration's going to do what it needs to do to move us forward.
And Allan, I'm still a Republican. I'm a conservative who believes that we need conservative leadership, mixed into the leadership. Conservative voices heard when it comes to governance in this country. And my greatest disappointment in the last 24 hours or 48 hours, whatever it was, is hearing Mitch McConnell, who could very well end up being the Senate Majority Leader again, say that we're going to block his cabinet appointments. We're going to block this. We haven't even gotten there yet. My greatest hope is that whoever ends up with the majority in the Senate, and it could very well end up being Republicans, I acknowledge that, will come to the president as openly as I believe Joe Biden is going to go to them. There are always going to be issues where we're going to fight and disagree. That's okay. That's what our system is. That's what democracy is all about. But we need COVID response. We need aid to the people for this pandemic. That's one of the things that Mitch McConnell and others in the Senate are already saying, they may try to block, that they don't want to cooperate on. There are things that the majority of the American people agree on, but more importantly than that, there are things that the majority of the American people really need in this moment. So my greatest hope is that my party will step into this moment, that they won't take the approach that they took with Barack Obama, where they won't look at it as their responsibility is to create gridlock so that they're able to blame the president for something and better position themselves for a presidential election 4 years down the road from right now. I hope they step into this moment and provide the leadership that the American people need. I'm not convinced that they will. Okay. Which is why the Lincoln Project is playing in the Senate races in Georgia, but it is what our country needs right now.
Let me take that thread and move it slightly differently. And I want to ask Maggie and Terry to weigh in on this thing, because I think that both sides have a litany of complaints of how the other side treated people. In other words, how Trump was treated when he became president, how Obama was treated when he became president by Republicans. So let's assume that, there's plenty of blame to go around. Okay. Everybody's sort of both sides have acted poorly at different times when they could have acted more in the public spirit. And we at American Public Square, of course, what we're about is trying to get people who don't agree with each other to try to figure out what they might agree on and maybe accept the fact that you're not going to get everything that you want. What concerns me the most is there a scenario that you see where Republicans could cooperate with the Biden administration without being hurt politically? Because I understand when politically it is, in other words, if your likelihood of losing your next election is increased because you're being cooperative, you're much less likely to be so. Do we have the opportunity to change that narrative? Because it's really, but it's not, by the way, not exclusive to Republicans, but just the position the Republicans are in right now. Maggie, what do you think?
So the answer to your question is yes, because we've been there before. And as someone who has had the honor and the privilege of working with and on behalf of Bob Dole, who is a wonderful example of bipartisanship in the Senate, there is a way to do that, and it's imperative that we do that. So what it's going to demand, though, is that from top down and bottom up, whether it's the grassroots level who is demanding that from our elected officials, but it also takes the leadership from those who are in office to make that happen. We didn't get to this position overnight. We're not going to get back to that true bipartisanship position overnight either. But it's a sad day for America if the answer to that question is no.
Terry, what do you think?
Well, I mean, some of this just kind of depends on what issue are we talking about. I don't think we would ask the Democrats to compromise on abortion policy, and so if that's what we're talking about, then there's not going to be a lot of compromise between the parties.
No.
I'm just saying, so certainly there's room in the center for a lot of things to happen, and if you look at how the pandemic related bills were done before we've had this last fight, right? Republicans and Democrats got together and passed it quickly through the House and the Senate with what I recall was a pretty minimal amount of rancor. And so I do think on issues where the country needs to address them, that there's an opportunity to do that. And it'll be a case where, both sides are going to have to compromise. I read a recent article where, Joe Biden, I think in negotiations with Mitch McConnell, I forget over what the subject was, laid out the predicate or the ground rule that, I'm not going to tell you about your politics and you're not going to tell me about my politics. If you say you can't do it, you can't do it. And if I say I can't do it, I can't do it. And we're just going to take each other's word for it. If we can go about it that way, then I think there's some opportunity to make some things happen.
Rosy, do you think that Democrats can, give ground on issues that are very, near and dear to the hearts of either the progressive wing or the moderate wing in order to get something done? Because, I think one can argue that, frankly, Congress hasn't legislated for about the last 10 or 15 years, except for kicking the can down the road on continuing resolutions on appropriations and in the midst of a crisis. And politically, people continue to get reelected. So the question is are they willing to take chances to get it done?
Rosa is going to let you take that first.
Oh, okay.
No, it's up to you. No, I'm going to try, I might do a little bit of a level set. And I think this is true of both parties. So I'm not trying to come at this particular part as a partisan. But I think the nature of how you are treated on the front end ends up reflecting what happens next. And I think the nature of both parties is it's become a little bit of a tit for tat. So if someone feels like they're wrong, they then perform an equal or greater wrong when they get the opportunity to do that. And that's my fear right now, is I do think the tone is being set by what's happened with the Trump administration, not turn over the transition, denying that this has occurred, that then what happens is Biden's politics become harder because the progressives are like, you guys are always looking to cut a deal. That's what moderates do. Let's hold the line. Let's try and ramp things forward, regardless of it being a divided government. And I think that becomes the challenge. And I think on the Republican side, the same thing happens. Like when you had some Republicans trying to work with Obama in the early years, that would happen. So I think it's an equal thing, but I just think we're kind of in this, death spiral, so to speak, in terms of the tit for tat thing. And that is what becomes more problematic, because I can already tell the goodwill and the tone of trying to work with Republicans and Mitch McConnell. There's already this internal friction of like, see, no one on the Republican side is calling for Donald Trump to change his behavior. And that's what I think it becomes dangerous. And I think, you know, if Democrats 4 years from now or 8 years from now get a chance to repay it the same way, my fear is they will. And that's not good for the country. Anyway, sorry, Rosie, I talked long.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, and I, you know, to what Terry said, it depends on what we're talking about. You know, I think I remember, Biden said, you know, he remembers a time when the compromise, we were talking about moving corporate taxes from 37% to 35 or 34, whatever the conversation was at that point. Now we're talking about, you know, is climate change real or fake? Or, you know, do we have a pandemic or not? You know, and I think you're not going to see the progressive wing or Democrats, period, budge on some of these key issues, like, you know, going back into the Paris Accord agreement and, you know, and the next stimulus bill that is really needed for COVID relief. You're not going to see us, and I hope, you know, the Biden administration doesn't forget about the base on some of these really key issues that are really not issues for the Democratic base, they're issues for the entire country. So, you know, I think it depends on what we're talking about. I look forward to the day when we're talking about, you know, the corporate tax rate again, and whether we need to, you know, increase it or cut it or whatever. And we're not, you know, I guess my point is we need to get back to arguing about solutions and not the problem, which at this point, we can't even agree on what the problem is. And so I hope we get back to that, and we can really solve some issues when we move forward on in that way.
Allan, I think there's something really unique about this exact moment that offers opportunities to bring leadership that the American people are looking for. You know, the first would have been for all of our Republican leaders to acknowledge and congratulate Joe Biden when it was clear and obvious that he was the nominee and that he was a president-elect. The fact that they didn't is a lost opportunity. I think that there is an equally and maybe even more powerful one that is right in front of us, however, in the response to the pandemic. If the Republican leadership in the House and Senate, however it all plays out in the end, will come to the table with Joe Biden and will accept what the science and the medical professionals are telling us about this, and we can all recognize that getting past the pandemic and controlling it is going to require sacrifice across the country, across economic and political spectrums, and really come in good faith and look at this as more than just a fight over this relief bill or that relief bill, but really embrace the entire solution.
Just lost you, Jennifer.
As well as to save our economy. I think there's a real opportunity there for Republicans to rise above.
Okay, let me just say a couple quick things, because we're already over time, but I'd like to keep this conversation going for another couple hours. But you all probably have things like families and homes and things like that to do. First of all, let me just do a quick, which I never do, but I want to do this. I'm curious, a lightning round, if we will. What's going to happen in Georgia? Let's start with you, Terry. What's going to happen?
I think it's likely to go Republican. I'm pretty confident that one will. I think it's.
Is it 0, 1, or 2 Republican?
I think it's probably 2, but I think it's at least 1.
Okay, Maggie.
I agree. I think definitely 1, probably 2.
Jennifer.
I think it's most likely to be a split decision, but we're going to be working hard in there to make it 2 Democrat.
I understand. Rosy.
I think it's likely to be a split decision as well.
And who's going to win? Which one's going to win? You think in the split decision? Okay,
I don't want to say.
Okay, Howe, what do you think?
1. I think it's Warnock. They'll win.
You think it's a split decision?
Yeah.
And Warnock's going to win?
Yeah.
Okay, and the other thing, just everybody just needs to think about, if that happens, if it's a split decision, then what the Democrats have to do is lure 1. And currently they have to lure 4. And the difference between 1 and 4 in the U.S. Senate is a lot. So that's just part of the dynamic. It'll be interesting. And let me just sort of say this. I think that what President-elect Biden is talking about.
Alan, what do you think, by the way? You can have an opinion.
Let me say this, I haven't consulted the Farmer's Almanac yet. So once I do that,
right, fair enough.
I truly have no idea. I know the Democratic record in Georgia runoffs is 1 out of 10. So that's not inspiring as a Democrat. But I do think that obviously Georgia has changed quite a bit. So we'll see what happens. And I have a lot of confidence actually in Stacey Abrams. So with what she's done, so I suspect that the Democrats may well pick up one of them. And I do think that changes the dynamic whether you only have to move 1 senator on any given issue as opposed to even moving 2. So for whatever that's worth. Let me just say this. First of all, I want to thank all of our panelists for participating tonight. I do want to say that the President-elect Biden has talked about reaching across the aisle, trying to find common ground with a lot of places. And what we're trying to do at APS, that's what we're trying to do. And frankly, we're starting to talk to some other organizations around the country about this who are working in the same sort of space. And all of you on this panel really can help us play a role as we go forward and try to explain to people that you can have very different points of view, but still be, without challenging the motives of other people, you can challenge their judgment. And that's kind of what the American spirit has always been, at least in the past, and really until the past 20 years or so. And I think we've all let it get too far out of hand, because when we had the upper hand, we enjoyed it too much. And I think that we're all paying a price for it. So hopefully we can move forward. And with that, Denisha and Jack, thank you for being our roving reporter. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions, but we had 5 very, very good panelists, and that's what happens sometimes. So Denisha, let me turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to our guests for joining us tonight. It was a great conversation. I would also like to thank everybody who tuned in tonight for our program. At the conclusion of this event, you will be directed to a short post-event survey. Please take a few moments to complete. This information helps us improve our events and lets us know what kind of programs our supporters want to see. Finally, if you enjoyed this program and believe that conversations just like this one are important, please consider becoming a member of American Public Square. APS members help support our programs and allow us to continue to provide a space for civil, fact-based discussion. You can learn more about membership and its benefits by visiting our website. Once again, we here at American Public Square at Jewell, thank you for joining us. Have a great evening. Good night.
One final word here. It's okay. It's the prerogative, I guess. And that is that I want to thank the students in my class at William Jewell for the questions that they provided. I've enjoyed being with them through this entire semester. And Gary Armstrong, my partner in teaching the course, who's obviously carried the bulk of the load, but I've enjoyed being part of it. And thank you all for being here. And let's do this again in a couple of years, okay? Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.